Let's do this thing. Hello, this is Clayton Vance. Welcome back to Timeless Homes and our podcast today. What we're going to be looking at today is the principle of hierarchy in architecture. I know there's a whole bunch of stuff out there right now, and there are a lot of people who hate the idea of hierarchy. But in all reality, you can't live without it. If you want to see the visual representation of what equality of outcome looks like with zero hierarchy in an architectural standpoint, go to look at communist housing blocks in any communist bloc country, and you'll see what that looks like. And wow, it's incredibly unpleasant. So hierarchy is an essential component of being able to tell a story, an architectural story, an architectural composition. Hierarchy, more or less in essence, it's talking about differentiation. It's helping move a narrative along by positioning something in a place of visual importance relative to all the proximal things to it. And what this does is it takes something from being a background element and turns it into a foreground element. And that foreground element begins to help move the story along that you're trying to tell. This is only going to be able to be understood pictorially. So, regrettably, this particular podcast will be almost worthless for those who are just listening. So please go onto our website, timelesshome.org, or YouTube and watch this video if you are curious to know about how to use hierarchy to improve your architectural designs and understand how to make timeless architecture. There are pretty much 4 ways that I can come up with to differentiate things. And one is the relationships of things to adjacent things. The other one is the form a thing takes as it relates to the other things. The other is the scale of a thing, and the other is the detail. So relationships, the size, the detail, and the form are pretty much the ways you can differentiate from things. So I'm going to go to my screen, my tablet here, and try to illustrate these in a very, very basic form. So, first one. What did I say it was? It was relationships. If you're looking at rhythm, a musical rhythm, and I just start plunking out a single note, I'm going to try to space these lines equidistant from each other, just visually. And then I have another line here, and then here, and then the same equidistant. Which line do you notice? If you notice the line, maybe you notice the space. This is actually close enough to that one where it's not really noticeable. But if I put the line right there, because of the relationships of these and these, it sets this one apart from the rest based on the rhythm, even though in essence they're all pretty much the exact same thing. I'm just doing a little erasing here to make them all the exact same thing. So this one is placed in a position of importance by virtue of its relationship and in position to the other identical items adjacent to it. That's one way to achieve hierarchy. And we'll look at some architectural examples later in our architectural snippets, which will be kind of a post-production of this particular podcast. So head over to YouTube or our website to be able to see those as we evaluate and dive into these principles a little bit deeper on architectural facades. Right now what we want to do is just do a real quick fundamental podcast of how these things at their elemental level are manifest. Okay, shape. If I have, this was going to be a little harder to just do, if I just have some rectangles here, all in more or less the same, not quite, but try in here. Anytime you have a center, that begins to have a place of prominence, visual prominence, just by virtue of the fact that it's a center. If I have an even number of things and there is no center, but a void occupies the center rather than a solid, it becomes a little more confusing. But in terms of kind of your visual, your automatic natural inclination for the visual preference of something. But if I were to change the shape of one of these things and do this to it, I just put a little arch on the top of one of these things. Now which one do you notice? Wow, that just added visual importance to this piece pretty quick. Now, what if I do the same to this one over here? Okay, now what I've done is I've just created a visual point and a visual point, which are now acting more like bookends, and rather than that just hold the center together. So then what if I take this center piece, connect these two things, and turn this into the same sort of form and differentiate it that way? All of a sudden I've just repositioned this in the center and it now has its place of prominence. Okay, let's go back a little bit and see in an asymmetrical manner what happens if we play the same game. Even number of boxes. I'm going to put the arch right here. Still, it has its place of hierarchy. And you know what? The visual weights isn't honestly that offensive. For those who are incredibly anal and, what's the word I'm looking for? Help me out, Trevor. OCD. OCD, thank you. That right there is gonna drive them nuts. But for the rest of us who aren't that crazy OCD, it's not that bad. But what it does do, if all of these were voids and openings, what that just did is it signified this one as the dominant opening. If this was part of a building facade, where would you think the door was? It's right here, because that's where we just put all of the visual importance, and that should be the door. If we put it here rather than there, oops, did that line all wrong, we will have just confused everybody. And sometimes it's the objective of avant-garde architects and people and designers and stuff to confuse everybody. I don't know why, but whatever. But anyway, what this illustrates is the differentiation by shape and what that can do for you. So we've got proximity, which is locational relationships. We've got shape relationships. The next one is size relationships. So if we have these little boxes again, and then we have a big box, and a little box, and a little box. They're also pretty obvious that big box has the visual weight of the composition. And so size is another way. Pretty obvious. It's the same exercise we did last time with the shapes, but size is another way. And then another way to differentiate would be the ornamentation and detail. So, for instance, if I have 3 doorways, and these doorways have some door surrounds, and on one of these door surrounds, I begin to put some detail and some sort of architectural flourishes and some sort of indication of a capital, which is part of a classical architecture. If you're not familiar, watch some of our classical architecture things, and some fluting down these. Though they are in essence the same shape, the same size, and the same position relative to each other, one of them now has all of the visual dominance, or what we call hierarchy, because of its particular ornamentation. The thing where everything went wrong with ornament and the rejection of ornament by the modernist movement was when architects just went crazy with ornament and just kept going and going and going. And so rather than just do, some sort of classical pediment, let's break the pediment and then do more stuff in here, and then do more decoration above and below, and some people consider this really beautiful, and it certainly can be, but it becomes visually just really overbearing when done good or bad, and then you just lose all hierarchy with everything, because there's just too much visual stimulation. You lose all background elements and foreground elements because everything is trying to be a foreground element. And just like that wonderful line in the Incredibles cartoon from, what was that guy, the bad guy's name in the Incredibles, where he said, and we're going to make everyone super, and once everyone's super, no one will be. And then gave a nice maniacal laugh. So what was his name? I'm almost there. But anyway, you know what I'm talking about. If there's too much going on in a particular composition, you'll lose that sense of hierarchy. And so hierarchy, it's a fairly simple, elemental, fundamental principle to understand. But where we really go wrong is, particularly when we're doing our standard McMansion houses, which I do not endorse, but I still have to do them every now and then and occasionally, is where we think hierarchy is going to be achieved by putting some giant, ill-proportioned porch thing right in the front, and having different window types, and different dormer styles, and different this and different that, and it just goes on, and the list goes on. And so, oh look, I achieved hierarchy because blah blah blah. And it's like, no, you didn't. All you did is you just got everything imaginable and put it there. You don't have hierarchy without background elements. Background elements are critical in making something have a position relative to the other background elements. And in standard McMansion design, there aren't background elements. Everything is trying to be a forefront. You're trying to add so-called visual interest, and that adding of the visual interest just confuses the matter. And so when you change up materials, that's another way to do hierarchy, is to change up materials. And if you use a more hierarchy visual material or more substantial material, that'll give something a lot of hierarchy too. Like, for instance, if we were to lay out materials in terms of a standard, like what is a more dignified material than another material, we could start with all engineered materials at the very, very bottom, and plastics and just engineered stuff. And if we start going up the scale, what we can look at is not just durability, because plastics are incredibly durable, right? And so it almost negates the argument about durability and longevity. But in terms of natural materials, that principle applies in terms of durability and longevity. For instance, stone lasts longer than wood out in the environment. Stone lasts longer than brick. Brick lasts longer than wood. And so those things start setting up this hierarchy of material use in where you would use those materials in certain buildings, if those buildings had a particular hierarchy within a overall civic composition. For instance, if I had houses made of wood or brick, which one will have a position of prominence over the other? The brick house over the wood house, typically. If you have the exact same house, but you have to look at all of the things that we've talked about in terms of hierarchy of what makes and differentiates something from another thing. And so if you have two 5-bay colonials that are exactly the same proportion, scale, and shape and form, and are related to each other, the one that has the brick will be in a more visual dominant position by virtue of the material that is used on the house. If you do the same exercise and put stone on it, it depends on what the stone is. If it's cut stone, you just increase the level of hierarchy. I've had debates with colleagues and my employees and things about whether rustic stone in a random rubble pattern, can't spell on here. A rustic stone is more it has a more higher prominence on the hierarchy scale than brick. And I don't think I have an answer for that one. I think a more vernacular kind of random rubble pattern layout is lesser on the hierarchy scale than a really well composed brick house. And so I think it goes wood, rustic stone, brick, more formal stone that actually has coursing, some design, is cut, and that type of stuff. To your final real epitome, which is sculpted and cut stone. And that's kind of the top of the line. And so I guess I should have started with that. Man, I should have thought through this podcast a little bit closer, but there's more or less 5 ways to do it. And material is one of those critical things in order to add hierarchy. But you don't, if on your McMansion house, because that's what you got and you like it and that's great or whatever, having too many materials and putting brick on this, stone on this, combining brick and stone, and then doing vertical siding, then horizontal siding, and then shingles, and then some sort of metal panel. It's like putting all of those on the same thing. Man, you just lost the whole concept of hierarchy. Have a single material, and then a secondary material, and then so you have the primary dominant composition material, and then you have the secondary material, which starts to articulate the details, and maybe a tertiary material if need be. But you want to be able to use the materials to implement these things that we've talked about in terms of hierarchy, particularly in terms of ornament and shape. But that, in essence, gives us a beginning point for you as designers, you as homeowners, you as craftsmen, to understand why you would make certain design decisions and why you wouldn't make certain design decisions. Because you want to just think to yourself, how does this help the full narrative read? And if you're not the composer of the particular narrative behind the house, the story that's trying to be told, then try to get and understand the story so you can make the right decisions regarding the colors you use, because that affects material. And I guess color can, I'm just killing myself here. Color can change things up too, can it? But really, what we're talking about is differentiation. We had talked about shapes, forms, relationships, colors, materials, and the ornamentation or detail. And in differentiating things, make sure when you do it, there's purpose, and make sure that you have background elements that support it. So everything's not a foreground element. That's what most modernism does, is it makes everything a foreground element. Better modernism has the same sort of hierarchy as traditional stuff. And that's what makes things more timeless. And we know that, we feel it. So I'm going to sign off on this podcast. Come and watch some of our snippets as we look at actual architecture. And that will be, I think, a really helpful. And we'll see you next time as we look at another topic.